Hey Guru Nation, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share. Really means a lot to me. Look, this is a video that's going to be part practical. We're going to start out practical. And we're going to talk about how study coordinators can build their skill set. Because I really do believe, study coordinator is the gateway career to any career you want in clinical research. So now, provided it's at the right site. I think the smaller the site, the quicker you can develop a skill set, a marketable skill set. That's why oftentimes people in academic medical centers, they develop a skill set, but it may not be marketable because their skill set is applicable for other AMCs. And when you're talking about sponsors and CROs hiring for, let's say, the next level positions like CRAs, in-house CRAs, project managers, might not be the right skill set at an AMC. So generally, I say the smaller, the better. Let's start practical. Somebody asked me today, hey, what do I do as a coordinator when a patient reports an adverse event? And it's really a question that we can kind of dive a little deeper into. So an adverse event, any untoward occurrence, so a headache, whether or not it's related to the study drug, first of all, only the PI can make that assessment, and really only the PI needs to do that for an SAE, which is a serious adverse event, but it needs to be recorded. All AEs need to be recorded. Common AEs are headaches, nausea, stomach aches, things like that, dizziness. Those are common adverse events. So your job as a coordinator is to make sure your patient is telling you what adverse events they've experienced since their last visit. It's important to document adverse events because it's very unusual that a patient will complete a study and not have any adverse events. I mean, if I was honest with myself today, I probably had an adverse event. I drank a little too much coffee earlier. Normally I have one cold brew. Today I had 2 cold brews, and I got a little dizziness, like a little lightheadedness. And I know whenever I consume too much caffeine, that's an adverse event that I get. So if I were in a study, I would have to tell that to my coordinator, and they would have to document that. Vertigo, dizziness. And you could write a note to file. Patient experience, ingested too much caffeine, too much coffee, and experienced vertigo for about an hour, and it resolved. So it's very unusual for a patient to be in a long-term study and not have any adverse events. So that's like a red flag to FDA, to auditors. Now, there are adverse events of special interest for certain sponsors and certain protocols, and they have special forms. They're not serious adverse events necessarily, but they're adverse events of special interest that require reporting on a separate form because sponsors are really trying to hone in on these particular adverse events of special interest. Then there's serious adverse events, those that pose immediate risk to the safety and well-being of the patient, like anything requiring a hospitalization, death, in some cases pregnancy. I think actually, let me know in the comments, but usually pregnancy is an SAE. It's definitely a protocol deviation because most studies that I've seen don't want women getting pregnant in studies. So now, let's expand upon this because you can learn more about AEs. I've done videos on this. You can read in the book. You can watch the 5-hour video. Let's use this as an example. If you're a coordinator and you're trying to level up your skill set, besides the usual stuff I tell you, network, get on LinkedIn, interact with other sites, interact with your monitors, your best, if you're a coordinator and you want to be a CRA or an in-house CRA, your quickest ticket to that position is through your CRA that's monitoring your studies. But I digress because I've done a lot about networking. Let's take this adverse events as an example. Do as much as you can in your role as a coordinator. Always try to do more. So what if your site has a dedicated regulatory specialist? Try to get your hands dirty if at all possible. Usually those regulatory specialists at sites get busy and ask coordinators if they can do certain things like, hey, can you file this document in the investigator site file? I know my two coordinators, they're brand new coordinators. I have a regulatory specialist, and she'll ask them sometimes, hey, can you guys file this instead? You should jump at that opportunity because you're leveling up your skill set. It's another responsibility you can add to your resume. It makes you even more of a generalist. But let's take it even further. Let's go to these AEs, adverse events. Learn your therapeutic indications really well. For example, let's say you have a rosacea study. You should be very fluent in that therapeutic indication. And then let's say you have osteoarthritis study. Same thing. You should be very fluent in that therapeutic indication. Understand what the typical patient looks like for those things. What kind of meds do they take? What do their lab results look like? What other comorbidities do they have? What other medical conditions do they have? What are some adverse events of special interest? Furthermore, everybody ignores the investigator brochure. You should start to learn. I don't care if you're not a doctor. I don't care if you're not a pharmacist. I don't care what your background is. I don't care if you're a high school dropout that became a coordinator. It's never too late to start learning mechanism of action of these drugs. Whether that means Googling every other word that you don't understand, what you'll start to notice is that mechanism of action across therapeutic indications tend to be similar for investigational products within that therapeutic indication. Sometimes they're completely different. Those are even better because now you have opportunity to learn another mechanism of action. Those are the things that like physicians get really excited about that are doing research. Like my PI, first thing he asks me when I bring him a new study, what's the mechanism of action? When I tell them, they say, oh, that's a new one. So then they look into it. What's stopping you from doing the same thing? And I'm not expecting you to understand this stuff like you're a doctor on the level of a clinician or a molecular biologist. But what's stopping you from starting? And I'm guilty of this too. My first 10 years, it really hasn't been until the last, really like since COVID, like the last 3 years, that I've started honing in on this mechanism of actions. Like I actually started getting interested, and I consider myself a generalist, but I consider generalist to be a never-ending goal. Like the goalpost is always moving. So I started looking into every study we get. What's the mechanism of action? And then I start looking for similarities amongst other studies I've done for that same indication, or similarities for where this investigational product was used in other therapeutic indications. Usually if you read those investigator brochures, they'll tell you. And like I said, I'm guilty of this. I've ignored investigator brochures, mechanism of actions. I could care less in the past. And when I became a CRA, and now thankfully I'm back to being a site owner, I have the opportunity to do it again. But when I was a CRA, I understood the importance of being somewhat fluent on mechanism of action of drugs and being fluent on the language of these therapeutic indications. Because when you start having conversations with physicians and you don't know the basics, they feel like they're talking to somebody like, you know, there's no sync there. Like, why am I even talking to this guy? He knows nothing about my world. So it pays to know more. It usually pays to know more. I never thought I would be interested in mechanisms of action, and now it's like, because let's face it, once you learn the process of clinical research, it's probably a 2-year learning curve to like really learn the process of being a coordinator. Maybe a year. A year to 2 years to like learn the process, not to master it, but just to be competent enough to be a above average coordinator. Probably gonna take you another 5 years to master your craft, like top 5% of coordinators in the world. what do you do when you've reached those goals? You can choose to just coast, which is there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're ambitious, like I'm guessing you are if you're watching this video, you should always strive to do better, myself included. So I've been ignoring these mechanisms of action, but quite frankly, I've been getting bored of like just the process of coordinating, and then even later on in my career, the process of training others and the process of making these videos for you. Like, to me, I need new challenges. And I found a challenge that I'm not going to master for the rest of my career, because when you break down all the therapeutic indications that I'm going to be involved with over the rest of my career, and all the innovations happening in our space, and all the black swan events that can happen every decade or so, like, I don't know, a pandemic, you're going to start challenging yourself. And in my case, it's learning the science behind the drug that I've been ignoring for so long. And in your case, don't make the same mistakes as me. Try to learn that stuff early on. That's part of being a generalist. When you go interview to be an in-house CRA or a CRA, and they ask you, hey, as a coordinator, when you've done asthma trials, tell us something about some of the assessments. And they're thinking, well, we need to see what this person understands about the assessments. We want to make sure they're not just a robot that had the PI and sub-Is do everything, and they're just documenting things and checking boxes and entering that in EDC. So they want to make sure that you have a holistic understanding of the subject. So if you, like with the asthma example, if you don't know what a pulmonary function test is, like, how good is your experience as a coordinator in asthma studies? Or same thing in schizophrenia. Let's say you don't know what a positive and negative symptom of schizophrenia is. Well, how practical really is your experience? Like, we don't necessarily need another person to check boxes and enter data. As a CRA, you're taking it next level. You're holistic. You're supposed to be proactive, preempt errors from sites. So I don't know if it's a rant. I want you guys and gals watching to not make the same mistakes as me. I want you guys to progress quicker than I did, because I only just recently started getting interested in this stuff, and this stuff's quite honestly fairly interesting. So once you've figured out the process and you find yourself stalling and getting complacent, challenge yourself, because this is how you're going to be more of a generalist. And this applies to everything. Like, if you don't know typical con meds for certain therapeutic indications, that's going to be evident in your interview when you go interview to be a CRA or an in-house CRA or whatever it may be. So learn, always be curious, always be learning more things about your craft. Don't just master the process, master the whole arena of where you operate. Let me know what you think, Guru Nation. Maybe some motivation, maybe a little practical advice. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Take care.